Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this week's episode of Horns, we hear from author Joby Warrick about the tale of the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons capability, specifically their stockpile of Sarin nerve gas. As Warrick relates the tale, this dramatic international effort undertaken in the middle of a civil war helped to forestall the possibility of these weapons being used against Syrian civilians and prevented countless thousands of possible deaths. This is a fascinating and little-known tale that was rapidly overshadowed by the growth of ISIS and other developments of violence in the region, but is worth bearing in mind as we consider ways in which the international community might be able to come together to help forestall other incidents of violence and ongoing conflicts. This event was recorded at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
So my name is Paul Edgar. Thanks for coming today. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Mr. Joby Warrick. Mr. Warrick has been a Washington Post journalist for more than 25 years, and about 20 of those years working on the national security beat, writing about the Middle East, terrorism, and weapons proliferation. As with all truly great journalists, Mr. Warrick found himself becoming a historian. And his first book, The Triple Agent, recounts the 2009 suicide attack by an Al-Qaeda informant on a CIA base in Khost, Afghanistan, that killed 7 intelligence operatives and 1 Jordanian intelligence operative. His second book, Black Flags: The Rise of ISIS, which was awarded a 2016 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. And today, Joby's going to talk to us about his third book, Red Line: The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. It's a fascinating story, and some of which you were certain, if you have not read the book, it's a story that you're already familiar with parts of it. You're certainly familiar with parts of it, but you're almost also certainly not familiar with most of it. With that as an introduction, please help me give a warm welcome to Mr. Joby Warrick.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, and especially you repeat, people here. Thanks for being at breakfast this morning and coming back for more punishment. So I hope this is enjoyable. I have to say, Speaker's supposed to say that I'm glad to be with you, but I am absolutely delighted to be out of my house after the last 2 years and to come to Austin. I have been talking about this book for a year. This is literally the very first time just today that a book presentation is not involved looking at faces and tiny boxes on my computer screen. So this really feels great. It's also the first time I've had to worry about wearing pants, though, too. So I did remember to do that. I know you're all greatly relieved. I'm going to get into this right away, but just a bit of a prologue, just a bit of history here. Exactly 11 years ago, just next week, 11 years ago, there were a bunch of boys messing around this little town in southern Syria called Daraa. And they got the idea to spray paint some graffiti on a school wall, something boys will do, something I must have done at point in my life. And some of the graffiti was anti-government, so something like down with the dictator, down with President Assad, that kind of thing. And Syria being a police state, they got in trouble, they got arrested, they got put in jail, interrogated and beaten some more, pretty savagely. This went on for a week, then for a second week, and by this point, the town itself is getting pretty riled up. So neighbors, family members, relatives come out in the street to start to protest against the police. That little protest helped ignite a national protest movement, which was just beginning to crest with Arab Spring. That national protest movement becomes an uprising. That uprising became a civil war. 11 years later, the spark that set that off, that conflict, it's still going on today. And it's a frozen conflict in some ways. It seems to be not as violent at this particular phase. It's disappeared almost completely from the news, but it remains one of the most consequential, unresolved conflicts of our time. And we can say that even today with Ukraine going on and all the madness in other places in the world. This is a very consequential conflict. And I'll explain some reasons. To understand why it's so, just think about what Syria has given us over the last 11 years. There's been the refugee flow, 14 million people displaced, 7 million of them outside the country. the waves of refugees heading into Europe and setting off a backlash, sort of anti-immigrant, very nationalistic populism that just shattered democratic institutions. We've seen it across Europe and in other places as well. We wouldn't have ISIS as we know it today if it hadn't been for Syria. In Syria, in this lawless place, this organization found an opportunity to rebrand itself and to create itself as this international global movement. They're still there. The caliphate's gone, but they're very much still in Iraq and Syria, and they've metastasized. They're truly around the globe. In Syria, Russia saw an opportunity to expand militarily, to expand its influence. Syria became the first place outside the old Soviet empire where Russia decided to be adventurous and to become involved in a military operation outside its own turf. And it used Syria, and we can talk about this later, as a place to try out new weapon systems and new military doctrines, sort of shadow war, hybrid war, a mix of air-powered intelligence, the kinds of things that we've done in other countries, but now they've become very good at as well. It also became a training academy for a whole generation of military officers, many of whom are now in Ukraine as we speak. It became a place of great importance for the Iranians, who had great relationships with the Syrians initially, but Syria for them became almost a military colony. And you see there today Iranian military bases, a legion of different militia groups loyal to the Iranians, and the one thing they've always wanted, which is a land corridor, which now stretches from Tehran across the Levant to the Mediterranean Sea, a way for them to get supplies and equipment to their good allies, Hezbollah and Lebanon. And of course, there's the human suffering, which continues and is so horrific that most Americans really have just begun to avert our gaze collectively. We don't like to think about it. But it's more than just the wounds and the scars. It's also the after effects, the generation of young children who have not known schools properly in their entire lives, who've grown up in a war zone, who've grown up around a very radicalized population, who live in a place where there's really no hope. But despite the direness of this, and despite the fact this is a very much unresolved conflict, there have been some reasons for optimism and hope, even in this extremely dark place. And in my book, I describe partly a disaster that doesn't happen. There's a near miss that occurs. It's a story of a crisis that, if it happened, could have changed history, but it was narrowly, and I would argue, almost miraculously averted. Within this story, we see reasons to be encouraged and even hopeful. We see that Americans can sometimes do things important with cooperation with allies and with the international community. And so we're going to get a bit to this backstory behind the bigger story that's Syria today. The book is also a bit of a sequel to my earlier book called Black Flags, which is essentially the origin story of the terrorist group we know as ISIS. And Black Flags describes some of the key personalities that became ISIS, including this man. This is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was a gangster and thug from Jordan, and he became one of the most important terrorist leaders of our generation, second only to bin Laden himself. He has some provocative ideas about terrorism, what it should look like, how ambitious it should be, and his great desire was to have a weapon of mass destruction. If your desire as a terrorist is to frighten and shock and to create a sensation, what better way to do that than with a nuclear, biological, or chemical weapon? Problem is, it's hard for amateurs, even for terrorists, to get their hands on WMD. Unless you're in an Austin Powers film and your name is Dr. Evil, it's really not that easy to do. Nuclear biological weapons are extremely technically complex. Chemical weapons aren't quite as daunting, but to make good ones, it's pretty hard. In Black Flags, I describe how Zarqawi tried in 2004 to carry out a chemical weapons attack in his home country, Jordan, but was thwarted. And I also show how he conducted grisly experiments using animals as test subjects, something that ISIS does later on as well. He managed to kill a lot of dogs and rabbits, but he never came close to having a military-grade chemical weapon. To accomplish that, he needed to steal something, to get something good from a country that already had it, or he needed to somehow acquire territory, a state with laboratories and factories and scientists, a place where he could make weapons of his own. Now, Zarqawi did not live to see any of that, but his followers, ISIS, got their big chance in Syria. Here they were able to build a formidable army. Here they managed to seize territory and eventually create their own state. And here, within close reach, were vast amounts of that deadly poison that Zarqawi so coveted, and particularly something called sarin. Now, you've all heard of sarin. It shows up in lots of bad movie plots. But what's so special about it? Sarin is a chemical weapon. Chemical weapons are considered weapons of mass destruction, but with an asterisk. If you talk to experts, they don't think that chemical weapons are really in the same league as other kinds of WMD. From a military point of view, they're really actually not very great weapons. So they became famous in World War I in the trenches, but by the 1920s, they were pretty much already obsolete because armies were more mobile. You can get around the plume, you can fly over it, you can protect yourself with a mask. So they weren't that great as far as a tool to use against armies. And yet, despite these limitations, military scientists continued to tinker with new ones. In Nazi Germany in the 1930s, some scientists came up with probably the greatest one ever, completely by accident. They were experimenting with some new poisons to use against fleas, essentially a pesticide. They came up with one that was too good. It killed everything. It killed insects, animals, and humans with just minute quantities. And you didn't even have to ingest it. You could even rub some of it on your skin. You could get a lethal dose that way. This was the first nerve agent, and the Nazis tweaked the formula, and they gave it the name Sarin, which is essentially an amalgam of the names or the initials of the scientists who made the thing. So this is very much a sort of a Nazi product. Now, the Nazis would manufacture tons of sarin before the outbreak of World War II, and they didn't use it at all in battle, which is kind of curious. You'd think they would use anything. But because Hitler was a World War I veteran himself, he knew about chemical warfare, he detested it, and he was afraid the Allies would respond in kind if he used it, so the stuff stayed in bunkers and was never touched. And then when Germany gets overrun by Soviet and American armies, they discover this stuff in bunkers, and both the Americans and the Soviets took some of it home with them, took home samples. And eventually, Russia and America would both create huge stockpiles of sarin. And people forget this, but we had a massive chemical weapons program in this country with sarin and with other nerve agents and with biological weapons too. And again, it was clear that these were poor battlefield weapons, but the idea was never about killing soldiers. In a war of cities, when it's just city versus city, silent killers like sarin would be the ultimate terror weapon. So the purpose was not to kill, but to frighten and demoralize your opponent. And therein lies their great power. And yet, as the Cold War ended, Russian and American leaders looked into the abyss and thought, this is too crazy for us. These weapons are too horrible to ever use. And so they agreed to destroy their stockpiles. In our country, this has been going on now for a couple of decades, just destroying what we had. It's cost billions of dollars. We're still not done with it. It just shows how hard it is technically to destroy the weapons once they're here. They also pushed for a new international treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and outlawed chemical weapons essentially of all kinds for all countries. All but a handful of nations around the world signed this treaty, and one that didn't sign it was Syria. And that was kind of puzzling. Why would the Syrians refuse? We discover the reasons in the opening lines of my book, in the story of a man who, beginning in the 1980s, was one of the CIA's most important spies in the Middle East. The spy's name is Ayman. He's a scientist. This is not him, actually. So I was explaining earlier, we decided I had to agree not to use his last name because his family is outside Syria and there were worries about repercussions against them. So this is our generic stand-in for Ayman. But he happens to be Syria's #1 expert on chemical weapons, and his specialty is sarin. And as we meet him in the book, he has just created a new formula for sarin that's totally unique. There's nothing like it in the world. He's a bit of a quirky guy. For one thing, he's a bigamist. He's married to 2 women, which you can do legally in Syria, but it's not very common in a professional class. It's a bit of a throwback. And in conversations in the book with his CIA handlers, he goes out of his way to try to justify his living arrangement. And he explains that his first wife was a great cook, but then he met this other woman who happens to be his secretary. And, oh, by the way, she's much younger. And so now he's got these 2 women at home, and he's bringing the CIA handler into his house and meeting the fam and trying to get along with everyone. And he says that his idea was to create a spicier love life for himself, but he ended up with perpetual heartburn because the 2 women yelled at each other constantly, except when they came together to yell at him. And so his advice was, I don't recommend this. Don't do it. But Ayman is proud of his work. He might be a traitor, but he's absolutely unapologetic about his invention, mostly because of his hatred for his country next door, Israel. Now, Israel has nuclear bombs, and Syria doesn't. So Syria needed to have its own deterrent. And so this would be his contribution to his country. He was going to create a chemical weapon so powerful that it could be put in a warhead and launched to Tel Aviv and kill potentially thousands of people. One study the CIA ran, it's estimated you could kill 15,000 people in a city with a targeted chemical weapons attack. But was the weapon any good as Ayman claimed? To answer that question, one day Ayman gives his CIA handler a sample. The two meet in a car in Damascus, and he just hands over a package. Inside the package is a little vial of sarin. And it's close to Christmas time, and he says, "It's almost Christmas. You're a Christian. Here's a present," and gives him the sarin to take home. That goes back to the CIA. They test it, and they're very impressed. Ayman has created a lethal masterpiece, and Syria is suddenly in a whole new category. Syria possesses WMD. Now, fast forward 10 years. In 2011, that civil war we talked about is starting to really rage. Syria is being torn apart. The government's losing control. And if you're the CIA, if you're the Pentagon, you're getting pretty nervous. Because you're seeing, here's a country that has chemical weapons, tons of them. They're scattered around the country. They're very good. And they're very portable. There's no weapon of mass destruction that's easier to lift and move around than a chemical weapon. And now they're vulnerable. Just a couple of liters of sarin smuggled out of the country could change history in a terrorist attack. It could force the US or other countries to get involved in a conflict they don't want to get involved in. So this is the looming catastrophe that faces the US administration in 2012. How does it respond? Well, let's look at that briefly. In red line, you witness frantic deliberations as the Obama White House is confronted with a pair of hair-on-fire emergencies with no good options for dealing with either of them. The first one takes place in the middle of 2012. Intelligence intercepts reveals that something is happening with Syria's chemical weapons. They're coming out of their bunkers and they're being moved around. We talked to the Israelis, they're seeing the same thing. The Israelis believe that the weapons are being delivered to Hezbollah, which is the militia group next door in Lebanon. Hezbollah has thousands of rockets and missiles pointed at Israel already. What if they get sarin too? So this is an extremely alarming event. So what do you do about that? How do you stop this potential disaster from happening? The Americans have been dreading this potential nightmare for a very long time, and they've been discussing fairly quietly, what do we do about this chemical weapons arsenal, which is suddenly quite dangerous? There's talk about, well, should we just bomb them? Why don't we just drop bombs in all these bunkers and destroy the munitions? The problem is you can't bomb sarin. If you hit a sarin stockpile, you're probably not going to destroy it all, and instead you're going to spread it. You're going to create a plume which drifts down to the village next door, and suddenly you've killed hundreds of women and children and some of the very people you hope to save. So that's off the table. What about sending in the Navy SEALs? Why don't we just parachute people in and grab them and take them out? We can't really do that either because they're scattered. We used to know where they all were, and we had a spy who ends up dying in the book. We won't go into the details of that, but we don't know exactly the locations of all of them. We do know they're widely scattered. They're heavily protected. And there's a war going on. The Pentagon does a quick study, and they figure out that in order to get in there and secure the weapons and get out again, you need 70,000 troops. That was the official estimate. So that's not going to happen either. So the only thing left to do is really to threaten the Syrians publicly. And so that happens on several different channels. We send diplomats to meet with the Syrians, to meet with the Russians, to meet with the Iranians, to pressure the Syrians to stop what they're doing. And Obama threatens them, threatens Assad very publicly in several speeches, saying, don't use these weapons, don't move them, or there will be consequences. And in one of those speeches, actually was the end of a press conference, he uses a colloquialism. He says, if you use the weapons, it'll cross a red line. So that's where that controversy came, just essentially responding to a real intelligence threat, but with a clumsy delivery that ends up coming back and seeming to force the administration into a box or put them to limit their options of how they're going to respond if someone did actually have a chemical attack. Interestingly, the warning did work for a while. The movement of chemical weapons stops, and the worries about a transfer of sarin start to recede. But it turns out that Assad doesn't really stop at all. He just gets creative. His generals start to rethink the use of their weapons. Originally, this is going to be a strategic arsenal, a way to sort of counter Israel's nukes. Now it becomes something that we can use to crush the rebellion, something to use against civilians in our own country. So they start rethinking delivery systems. Instead of putting the stuff in warheads, you can put it in a little tear gas canister or a little hand grenade or an artillery rocket or a mortar shell. And so they began to experiment with variations of this, sometimes with just dropping a single device or a single canister in a village someplace, and there might be one casualty or one person killed or 2 or 3, just trying it out to see if it really is effective. And then one morning in August 2013, Asad miscalculates. There had been intense fighting in the suburbs, the outer suburbs of Damascus, and the army is launching an offensive against rebels there. And they drop a couple of artillery shells and sort of artillery rockets into some of these villages on the outskirts of Damascus. And what I guess they didn't really appreciate is the fact that sarin, being heavier than air, starts to seep down into the basements and bunkers where families have gone for shelter. So they're essentially seeking protection from bombs. They go into basement to sleep, and here comes the sarin gas into the places where they were staying. And suddenly you get this massacre occurring that I think shocked even the Syrians. The Americans estimate that 1,400 people were killed and many more people were injured, and some suffered continuing debilitating injuries. This handful of rockets on one day created the biggest single loss of life of any day in the Syrian conflict. It just shows you the power of these things. One attack, and you have at least 1,400 people killed according to the American estimates. So it's a very effective weapon and very powerful. Now, for the White House, this second crisis is not about a dangerous weapons transfer. It's about a war crime. The world is outraged. Obama's furious. His red line has been publicly challenged. So he gathers his military advisors and orders them to start planning for what everyone expects will be an immediate military strike. Ultimately, as we know, he doesn't strike. And the reasons were spelled out in the book, and I won't get into them all. But again, the military options weren't so great. They realize they can't strike the depots themselves. They can't get rid of the chemical weapons, which is the one thing they really want to do. You could target the Syrian leadership. You could go after Assad. But let's say you bomb the palace and you kill the president. Then what happens? In 2013, the most powerful militias in the country are ISIS and this group, al-Nusra, which is controlled by al-Qaeda. So do you get rid of Assad, and then you get a terrorist group instead in charge of the country? When the Pentagon planners were talking about this possibility, they called it the catastrophic success scenario. Getting rid of the bad guy and then getting something even worse in his place. So the remaining option is punitive, a strike that will punish Syria and project toughness, but doesn't go beyond that. And it's essentially, interestingly, it is exactly the same plan, almost to the dot, that Trump would adopt a few years later when Syria again challenged the red line. So just launch a few missiles, you destroy some airplanes, you knock out a runway, respond to their violation, and we saw the impact of it. Syria was rebuilding the airport and using it again the next day. The bombings, the barrel bombings, and all the atrocities that they were doing continued. So as a deterrent, it didn't really work. So that's why these decisions can be so complex, because there are no real good solutions or answers to these kinds of challenges. The punitive strike is still a viable option. It looks like Obama is going to do that, but even that option runs into obstacles. Obama wants to strike immediately, but it so happens there is a team of U.S. investigators on the ground in Damascus at that time looking into some of the previous allegations of chemical weapons use. So these guys are in Damascus. They can see the plumes from the attack in Ghouta from their hotel room. And so they gallivant off to the crime scene to collect evidence. And so there's a worry that they will either get caught in the crossfire, they might be held as hostages. And it just looks bad if you have a UN fact-finding team on the ground investigating the crime and you send missiles before the conclusions are known. If you get a chance to read the book, the guy who led the investigative mission, this is him on the right, his name is Sellström. He was just a Swedish medical professor who ends up getting put in charge of this team, and they were absolutely fearless. They decided they're going to collect evidence from this chemical weapons attack despite the risk to themselves, despite the fact they get shot at by snipers as they proceed down the road to try to investigate this crime. They get held at gunpoint. All kinds of terrible things happen to them, but they insist on doing their job. They're unarmed. They're getting UN, employee pay, and they risk their lives to do something very important, which turns out to be crucial in the end because the evidence they collected turns out to be, quite decisive and conclusive. Other obstacles, you end up getting Congress weighing in. Congress is demanding that Obama seeks approval before getting potentially involved in another Middle Eastern war. So Obama relents and asks for formal authorization, but Congress really just sets up the football to take it away again. It quickly is clear that there's no support in Congress for military action in Syria, and this time it's bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats, they polled members of Congress, including folks who would normally be friendly. Nobody wanted to authorize military action of any kind, even a limited airstrike. So Obama endures the humiliation of being forced to withdraw his bill without a vote, and now he's completely in a box. And at just this moment, here comes a big surprise. The Russians come along with a very interesting proposal. They say, if it's your goal to get rid of the Sarin, why don't we just do that? Why don't we convince the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons if you agree to postpone the airstrike? Now, until now, nobody has seriously considered the possibility that Syria will unilaterally disarm, get rid of its most important strategic weapon. It just wouldn't happen. They haven't even admitted or acknowledged having chemical weapons. But Russia, as Syria's most important ally, has leverage, and it has its own reasons for wanting to prevent a U.S. strike. So Obama takes a deal with skepticism. No one really believes that Syria is going to let a bunch of foreigners roam the country to destroy its top secret arsenal. Syria will eventually renege, and when it does, a military strike would be back on the table. Syria's cooperation aside, the logistics of this were insane. Where do you find folks who are going to parachute into Syria and hunt for deadly sarin in the middle of a civil war? Even if you got it out, where would it go? Where would you take it? There was no plan. There wasn't even a realistic notion for how this would work. And here's where the improbable success story comes in. Somehow this unlikely project succeeds. Not entirely, but mostly, remarkably. What happens in the next 9 months is one of the most striking feats of disarmament, just as a technical matter, in modern history. And if you blinked, you might have missed it. It succeeds mostly because of the ingenuity and fortitude of a collection of individuals who were put in charge of the mission. Because there's no international team that existed to pull off a job like this, a new one is created from whole cloth, consisting of UN workers and chemical weapons experts. And this is the leader. Her name is Sigrid Kaag. She's a Dutch diplomat. She has no experience with the military. She doesn't know anything about chemical weapons. She knows the Arab culture very well. She's very smart and very tough. And so they put her in charge. Within days, within a month after the strike, they're on the ground ready to go. Kaag is amazing. I've met with her a number of times. She's would just tuck her blonde hair under her hijab and just go toe to toe with these Syrian diplomats to try to keep them on track, to force them to do what they said they would do. And when that didn't work, she'd go across town and work with the Russians, or she'd go meet with the Iranians and get scolded because her too much of her hair is showing, or they think her outfit is inappropriate. But she essentially keeps after it day after day, and with a combination of diplomacy and charm and just grit, makes sure that the Syrians stay on task and get the weapons delivered to the port where they promised they could be taken out of the country. We learn later that Asad kept some of his weapons back. He hid some of the things away, and yet the bulk of Syria's chemical stockpile, CIA estimates that at least 90%, is hauled to a port to be taken out to sea. And all those factors is actually the more important part. It wasn't just the weapons themselves. The factories, the production centers, the bunkers, everything is taken apart and demolished and cut into pieces with torches. This all happens in 9 months in the middle of a civil war, and it's just amazing. So mission accomplished, right? Well, not quite. There's still as yet no place for these weapons to go. No country in the world is willing to accept them. What mayor or port manager that you know is going to say, sure, 1,300 tons of sarin, bring it right here to our city? Nobody wants this to happen. The solution to this problem comes from another of the book's heroes. This is Army chemical weapons expert Tim Blades. He's a colorful character. He's got physical scars, actually, from previous encounters with sarin. He's been working with this stuff his whole life. He's cantankerous. He's not very popular, but he's the kind of guy, he's sort of like the Ray Donovan of the chemical weapons business. If there's a cache of something found somewhere, anywhere in the world, the Army sends this guy and his team to find them and destroy them to make them go away. And in 2012, when the Pentagon is just beginning to think about how Syria's chemical weapons might become a problem, they go meet with Tim and they say, if we somehow get our hands on these, what can we do with them? Well, Tim has an idea. He draws it out on a napkin, and in a few months, his team builds a prototype for a unique invention. This thing is called the field deployable hydrolysis system, an unpronounceable acronym, but we call it the margarita machine. That's the name that sticks with it. It's great because it can destroy sarin, It could be hauled anywhere in the world, and it works. They test it out. It's great. So the Pentagon decides to order 7 of these machines. They go into a warehouse someplace, and nobody figures they'll ever actually get used. Months later, when the Syria deal came together, suddenly the world needs these machines. And since no country will accept these chemicals, the Pentagon decides to do the job at sea. The machines are bolted onto the deck of an old cargo ship, Cape Ray, here it is, and Blades, who's never spent a day in sea in his life, is put in charge of the mission of really what's the world's first floating chemical weapons destruction factory operating in the middle of the Mediterranean. This is not an optimal solution. A ship at sea is not a place where we want to have millions of gallons of really bad stuff sloshing around. Almost any big wave or storm could potentially jeopardize employees. It could even overturn the ship itself. And eventually problems do occur. Stuff breaks down. There's a minor spill. And then a potentially catastrophic problem emerges. And I explained this in the breakfast session a little bit. But there's this issue with, as you're operating the ship, the ballast for the ship is the fuel at the bottom. And as the ship's like doing circles in the middle of the Mediterranean, it's burning off its fuel. That means the ballast is disappearing and the ship is getting top heavy. And you're also putting lots and lots of waste on the top decks of the boat. So you've got a ship that after a while, you can feel it becoming more and more unstable. And they're getting at the end where they're doing their calculations and they're realizing that they may not make it, that just a few more days, a sudden wind or storm could completely capsize the ship, and then the whole operation is sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Another problem crops up. There are news stories about this chemical weapons ship in the Mediterranean, and all of Southern Europe gets just incensed about this. So you get protests organized. A flotilla of protest ships sets out to try to find and stop the Cape Ray. And obviously they can't board the ship, but you can imagine them making it stop in its tracks or just creating a sensation in the middle of the ocean. So you have all these problems on the back of poor Tim Blades, and yet somehow he and his crew keep chugging. They work for 42 days straight, 12-hour shifts, and then another shift comes on and continues to work, taking 1 barrel at a time, put them through the process, and neutralizing the chemicals. And after 42 days, the last one is loaded, the last few gallons of sarin precursor is destroyed, and it's done. Here at last was a victory that was worth savoring. But it's a mixed success. The war continues. The news about the Cape Ray and what it managed to do is completely overshadowed by other events. For one thing, ISIS is on the march across Iraq and Syria. And just as this was happening, ISIS is marching into Mosul and taking over the town. And then Asad starts using chemical weapons again. His sarin is mostly gone, so he switches to a cheap substitute. He takes ordinary chlorine, the industrial stuff he used in drinking water or swimming pools, and uses that as a chemical weapon and drops it from helicopters on little towns and villages. It's not very effective. It's not as deadly as sarin, but it's a terror weapon, and he uses it that way. Meanwhile, Assad is never punished for his crimes. Russia, which pushed Assad in the beginning to get rid of his weapons, now makes sure he avoids any real accountability at the UN or anywhere else. Today, there have still been no consequences, and because of that, the taboo against chemical weapons has been weakened. Other actors take notice. One of them is ISIS, which got to Syria too late to steal chemical weapons. But in the book, we see how they start to try to make chemical weapons on their own, and they succeed. They manage to make mustard gas. They have a real chemical weapons operation going before they lose control of Mosul, and then everything shuts down. Despite these setbacks, this one hopeful fact remains. The core of Syria's most dangerous weapons arsenal is gone. His factories and production centers are gone. In a moment when consensus and cooperation seems impossible, when the UN is dysfunctional and the United States often seems to be in retreat on the world stage, a few countries manage to summon the energy and the will to make something big happen. If those weapons had not been removed, someone very well might have used them to kill Syrians or to kill others. The world is undeniably safer with them gone. At the end of the Cape Ray's voyage, a congratulatory email comes in from Washington that summarizes what was accomplished and why it's a success to be remembered and celebrated. Here's what it says, and I'll end with this. 5 months to create the machine, 66 days to outfit the vessel, 42 days to destroy hundreds of tons of Syria's most dangerous chemical weapons at sea, the number we will never know, the number of men, women, and children who were saved from death by chemical weapons. Thank you for your time and your attention. I hope you enjoyed our journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.